Chapter 7 A Sudden Shock. As I stood there, muzzling over this too perfect triumph of man, the full moon, yellow and gibbous, came up out of an overflow of a silver light in the northeast. The bright little figure ceased to move above below. A noiseless owl flittered by, and I shivered with the chill of the night. I determined to descend and find where I could sleep. I looked for the building I knew. Then my eye traveled along the figure of a white sphinx upon a pedestal of bronze, growing distinct as the light of the rising moon grew brighter. I could see the silver birch against it. There was a tangle of rhododendron bushes, black in the pale light, and there was a light lawn. I looked at the lawn again. A queer doubt chilled in my complacency. No, I said stoutly to myself, that it was not the lawn. But it was the lawn, for the white leprous face of the sphinx was towards it. Can you imagine what I felt when this conviction came home to me? But you cannot. The time machine was gone. At once, like a lash across the face, came the possibility of losing my own age, of being left helpless in this strange new world. The bare thought of it was an actual physical sensation. I could feel it grip at my throat and stop my breathing. In another moment, I was in a passion of fear and running with great leaping strides down the slope. Once I fell headlong and cut my face. I lost no time in stancing the blood, but jumped up and ran on, with the warm trickle down my cheek and chin. All the time I ran, I was saying to myself, they have moved it a little, pushed it under the bushes out of the way. Nevertheless, I ran with all of my might, all the time, with the certainty that someone comes with exceedingly dread. I knew that such assurance was folly, knew instinctively that the machine was removed out of my reach. My breath came with pain. I knew I covered the whole distance from the hill crest to the little lawn, 2 miles perhaps, in 10 minutes. I am not a young man. I cursed aloud as I ran. At my confident folly in leaving the machine, wasting good breath thereby, I cried aloud. And none answered. Not a creature seemed to be stirring in that moonlight world. When I reached the lawn, my most fear would realize. Not a trance of the thing had been seen. I felt faint and cold when I faced the empty space among the black tank of bushes. I ran round it furiously, as if the thing might have been hidden in a corner, and then stopped abruptly, with my hand clutching my hair. Above me towered the sphinx upon a bronze pedestal, white, shining, leprous in the light of the rising moon. It seemed to smile in mockery of my dismay. I might have consoled myself by imagining the little people had put the mechanism in the shelter for me, had I not felt assured their physical and intellectual inadequacy. That is what dismayed me, the sense of some hitherto unsuspected power, through whose intervention my invention had vanished. Yet, for one thing, I felt assured, unless some other age had produced its exact duplicate, the machine could not have been moved in time. The attachment of the levers, I will show you the method later, prevented anyone from tampering with it in that way when they were removed. It had moved and was hid only in space. But then, where could it be? I think I might have had a kind of frenzy. I remember running violently in and out among the moonlight bushes all around the sphinx, and starting some white animals in the dim light I took for a small deer. I remember too, late that night, beating the bushes with my clenched fist until my knuckles were gashed and bleeding from the broken twigs, then sobbing and raving in my anguish and bind. I went down to the great building of stone. The big hall was dark, silent, deserted. I slipped on the uneven floor, fell over one of the mashite tables, almost breaking my shin. I lit a match and went on past the dusty curtains of which I have told you. There, I found a second great hole with cushions upon which perhaps a score or so of the little people were sleeping. I've no doubt they have found my second appearance strange enough, coming suddenly out of the quiet darkness with inarticulate noises and the sputter and flare of a match. For they had forgotten about matches. "Where's my time machine?" I began bawling like an angry child, laying hands upon them and shaking them together. It must have been very queer to them. Some laughed, most of them even sorely frightened. When I saw them standing around me, I came into my head, and I was doing as foolish a thing as possible for me to do under the circumstances, and trying to revise the sensation of fear. For reasoning from their daylight behavior, I thought that fear must be forgotten. Abruptly, I dashed down the match, knocking one of the people over in my course, went blundering across the big dinner hall again, out under the moonlight. I heard cries of terror as their little feet running and stumbling this way and that. Do not remember all I did as the moon crept up the sky. I suppose it was the unexpected nature of my loss that maddened me. I felt hopelessly cut off from my own kind, a strange animal in an unknown world. I must have revved to and fro, screaming and crying upon God and fate. I have a memory of horrible fatigue, as the long night of despair wore me away, of looking in the impossible place in that, of groping among the moonlight ruins and touching strange creatures in the black shadows, at last laying on the ground near the Sphinx, and weeping with absolute wretchedness, even anger at the folly of leaving my machines having leaked away with my strength. I had nothing left but misery. And then I slept. And when I woke again, it was a full day. And a couple of sparrows were hopping around me on the turf within reach of my arm. I sat up in the freshness of the morning, trying to remember how I had gotten there and why I had such a profound sense of desperation and despair. Then things came clear in my mind. With the plain, reasonable daylight, I took my circumstances fairly in the face. I saw the wild folly of my frenzy overnight, and I could reason with myself. Suppose the worst, I said. Suppose the machine altogether lost, perhaps destroyed. It behoves me to calm and patient, to learn the way of the people, to get a clear idea of the method of my loss and the means of getting materials and tools, so that in the end, perhaps, I make another. That would be my only hope. A poor hope, perhaps, but better than despair. And, after all, it was a beautiful and curious world. But, probably, the machine had been taken away. Still, I must be calm and patient, finding its hiding place, and recover it by force, or cunning. And, with that, I scrambled to my feet and looked about me, wondering where I could bathe. I felt weary, stiff, and travel-soiled. The freshness of the morning made me despair an equal freshness. I had exhausted my emotion, and indeed, as I went about my business, I found myself wondering at the intense excitement overnight. I made a careful examination of the ground about the little lawn. I wasted some time in futile questioning, conveyed, as well as I was able, to such a little people as came by. They all failed to understand my gestures. Some were simply stolid. Some thought it was a jest and laughed at me. I had the hardest task in the world, to keep my hands off their pretty laughing faces. It was a foolish impulse, but the devil begotten of fear and blind anger was ill-cured, and still eager to take advantage of my perplexity. The turf gave better counsel. I found a groove ripped in it, and about midday, between the pedestal and the Sphinx, and the marks of my feet where, on arrival, I had struggled with the overturned machine. There were no other signs of removal about. With queer, narrow footprints like these, I could imagine, made by a sloth. These directed my closer attention to the pedestal. It was, as I think I have said, of bronze. It was not a mere block, but highly decorated, with deep framed panels on either side. I went and rapped at these. The pedestal was hollow. Examining the panels with care, I found them discontinuous with the frames. There were no handles, no keyholes, but possibly the panels, they were not doors, I supposed, opened from within. One thing was clear enough in my mind. It took no great mental effort to infer that my time machine was inside the pedestal, but how it got there was a different problem. I saw the heads of two orange-clad people coming through the bushes and under some blossom-covered apple trees towards me. I turned smiling to them and beckoned to me. They came and then pointing to the brown pedestal, I tried to intimate my wishes to open it, but my first gesture towards them, they behaved very oddly. I don't know how to convey their expression to you. Suppose you were a grossly improper gesture to a delicate-minded woman, it is how she would look. They went off as if they had received the last possible insult. I tried a sweet-looking champ in white next, with exactly the same result. Somehow, his manner made me feel ashamed of myself, but, as you know, I wanted the time machine, and I tried it once more. As he turned off, like the others, my temper got the better of me. In 3 strides, I was after him, had him by the loose part of his robes around his neck, and began dragging him towards the Sphinx. And then I saw the horror and repugnance in his face, and all of a sudden I let him go. But I was not beaten yet. I banged with my fists at the bronze panels. I thought I heard something stir inside to be explicit. I thought I heard a sound of a chuckle. Must have been mistaken. Then I got a big pebble from the river, came and hammered till had flattened the coil and decorations, and the vigorous came off in powdery flakes. The delicate little people must have heard me, hammering in gusty outbreaks a mile away on either hand, but nothing came of it. I saw a crowd of them upon the slopes, looking futilely at me. At last, hot and tired, I sat down to watch the place, but I was too restless to watch long. I am too occidental for a long vigil. I could work at my problems for years, but waiting inactive for 24 hours, that is another matter. I got up about the time and began walking aimlessly through the bushes towards the hill again. Patience, I said to myself. If you want the machine again, you'll have to leave the Sphinx alone. If they mean to take your machine away, it's little good you're wrecking their bronze panels. And if they don't, you will get it back as soon as you can ask for it. To sit among all of those unknown things before a puzzle is like that is hopeless. That way lies monomania. Face this world, learn its way, watch it, be careful of too hasty guesses at its meaning. In the end, you will find clues to it all. Then, suddenly, the humor of the situation came to my mind. The thought of the years I had spent to study and toil to get into the future age, and now my passion of anxiety to get out of it. I had made myself the most complicated and most hopeless trap that a man had ever devised. Although it was at my own expense, I could not help myself. I laughed aloud. Going through the big palace, it seemed to me the little people avoided me. It may have been my fancy, or it may have been something of the hammering of the gates of the bronze. Yet I felt tolerably sure of their avoidance. I was careful, however, to show no concern and to abstain from any pursuit of them, and in the course of a day or two got back to the old footing. I made what progress I could in the language, and in addition I pushed my explorations here and there. Either I missed some subtle points, or their language was excessively simple. Almost exclusively composed of concrete subjunctives and verbs, substantives and verbs. There seemed to be few, if any, There seemed to be few, if any, abstract terms or little use of figurative language. Their sentences were usually simple and of 2 words, and I failed to convey or understand any but the simplest propositions. I determined to put the thought of my time machine and mystery of the bronze doors under the Sphinx as much as possible in the corner of my memory, until my growing knowledge would lead me back to them in a natural way. Yet a feeling, you may understand, tethered me in the circle of a few miles around the point of my arrival. Chapter 8. Explanation. So far, as I can see, all the world displayed the same exuberant richness as the Theiss Valley. From every hill I climbed, I saw the same abundance of splendid buildings, endlessly varied in material and size, the same clustering thickness of evergreens, the same blossom-laden trees and tree ferns. Here and there, water shore like silver, and beyond, the land rose into blue, undulating hills, and so faded into the serenity of the sky. A particular feature which presently attracted my attention was the presence of certain circular wells. Several, as it seems to me, of a great depth. One lay by the path up the hill, which I had followed during my first walk. Like the others, it was rimmed with bronze, curiously wrought, and protected with a little cupola from the rain. Sitting by the side of these wells, and peering down into the shafted darkness, I could see no gleam of water, nor could I start any reflection with a lighted match. But in all of them, I heard a certain sound, a thud, 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 like the beating of some big engine, and I discovered, from the flaring of my matches, that a steady current of air set down the shaft. Further, I threw a scrap of paper into the throat of one, and instead of fluttering slowly down, it was at once sucked swiftly out of sight. After a time, too, I came to connect these wells with a tall tower standing here and there upon the slopes. For above them there was often just a flicker in the air, as one sees on a hot day above a scorched beach. Putting things together, I reached to strong suggestion of an extensive system of subterranean ventilation, whose true import was difficult to imagine. I was, at first, inclined to associate it with the sanitary pathos of these people. It was an obvious conclusion, but it was absolutely wrong. And here I must admit that I learnt very little drains and bells and modes of conveyance, and the conveniences during my time in the real future. In some of these visions of utopias and coming times, which I have read, there is a vast amount of detail about building and social arrangements and so forth. But while such details are easy enough to obtain when the whole world is contained in one's imagination, they are together inaccessible to the real traveler amid such realities as I found here. Conceive the tale of London, which a Negro, fresh from Central Africa, would take back to his tribe. What would he know of railway companies, of social movements, of telephone and telegraph wires, of parcels delivery company and postal orders and the like? Yet we, at least, should be willing enough to explain these to him. And even of what he knew, how much could he make his untraveled friend either apprehend or believe? Then think how narrow the gap between the Negro and the white man of our own times, and how wide the interval between myself and these of the Golden Age. I was sensible of much which was unseen, and which contributed to my comfort. But save for a general impression of the automatic organization, I fear I can convey very little of the difference into your mind. In the matter of sepulture, for instance, I could see no signs of crematoria nor anything suggestive of tombs, but it occurred to me that possibly there might be cemeteries somewhere beyond the range of my exploring. This, again, was a question I deliberately put to myself, and my curiosity was at first, entirely defeated upon the point. The thing puzzled me, and I was led to make a further remark which puzzled me still more, that aged and infirm among these people there was none. I must confess that my satisfaction with the first theories of the automatic civilizations and decadent humanity did not long endure. Yet I could think of no other. Let me put my difficulties. The several big palaces I had explored were mere living places, great dining halls and sleeping apartments. I could find no machinery, no appliances of any kind, yet these people were clothed in peasant fabrics that much at times need renewal, and their sandals, though undecurated, were fairly complex specimens of metalwork. Somehow, such things must be made, and the little people displayed no vestige of their creative tendencies. There were no shops, no workshops, no signs of importations among them. They spent all their time in the playing gently, and bathing in the river, and making love in a half playful fashion, and eating fruit and sleeping. I cannot see how things kept going. Then again, about the time machine. Something, I knew not what, had taken it from the hollow pedestal of the White Sphinx. Why? For the life of me, I could not imagine. Those waterless wells, too. Those flickering pillars. I felt I lacked a clue. How shall I put it? Suppose you found an inscription with sentences here and there in excellent plain English, and interpolated interwith. Others made up of words or letters absolutely unknown to you. Well, on the third day of my visit, that is how the world of 2,701 presented itself to me. That day, too, I made a friend of a sort. It happened that I was watching some of the little people bathe in a shallow. One of them was seized with a cramp and began drifting downstream. The main current ran rather swiftly, but not too strong for even a moderate swimmer. It will give you an idea, therefore, of the strange deficiency of these creatures when I tell you that none made the slightest attempt to rescue the weakly crying little things which was drowning before their eyes. When I realized this, I hurriedly slipped off my clothes, and wading into the point lower down, I caught the poor mite and drew her safe to land. A little rubbing of the limbs soon brought her round, and I had the satisfaction of seeing what was all right before I left her. I had got to such a low estimate of her kind that I did not expect any gratitude from her, and that, however, I was wrong. This happened in the morning. In the afternoon, I met a little woman, as I believe it was, and I was returning toward my center from an exploration. She received me with cries of delight, presented me with big garland flowers, evidently made me alone. The thing took my imagination. Very possibly, I had been feeling desolate. At any rate, I did my best to display my appreciation of the gift. We were soon seated together in this little stone arbor, engaged in conversation, chiefly of smiles. The creature's friendliness acted me exactly as a child must have done. We passed each of the other's flowers, and she kissed my hand. I did the same to hers, and then I tried to talk. I found that her name was Weena, though I didn't know what that meant, somehow seemed appropriate enough. That was the beginning of a queer friendship which lasted a week and ended, as I will tell you. She was exactly like a child. She wanted to be with me always. She tried to follow me everywhere, and on my next journey out and about, she went to my heart and tie her down. To tire her down and leave her at last exhausted and calling after me rather plaintively. But the problems of the world have had to be mastered. I had not said to myself, come into the future to carry on a miniature flirtation. Yet, her distress when I left her was very great. Her expulsions at the parting were sometimes frantic, and I think altogether I had as much trouble as comfort from her devotion. Nevertheless, she was, somehow, a very great comfort. I thought it was a mere childish affection that made her comfort from her devotion. Nevertheless, she was, somehow, a very great comfort. I thought it was mere childish affection that made her cling to me until it was too late. I did not clearly see what I had inflicted upon her when I left her, nor until it was too late did I clearly understand what she was for me. For by merely seeming fond of me and showing in her weak, futile way that she cared for me, the little doll of a creature presently gave me return to the neighbor of the white finks, almost a feeling of coming home, and I would watch for her tiny figure of white and gold so soon as I came over the hill. It was from her, too, that I learned the fear had not yet left the world. She was fearless enough in the bright daylight, and had the oddest confidence in me. For once, in a foolish moment, I made threatening grimaces at her, and she simply laughed at them. But she dreaded the dark, dreaded shadows, dreaded black things. Darkness to her was one thing dreadful. It was a singularly passionate emotion, and it set me thinking and observing. I discovered them, amongst other things, that these poor people gathered in great houses after dark, and slept in droves. To enter upon them without a light was to put them into a tumult of apprehension. I never found one out of doors, or sleeping alone with doors after dark. Yet, I was such a blockhead that I missed the lesson of the fear, and in spite of Weena's distress, I insisted upon sleeping away from these slumbering multitudes. It troubled her greatly, but in the end her odd affection for me was triumphed, and for 5 of the nights of our acquaintance, including the last night of all, she slept with her head pillowed on my arm. But my story slips away from me as I speak to her. It must have been the night before her rescue that I was awakened about dawn. It had been restless, dreaming, but most disagreeably, that I was drowned, and the sea anemones were feeling over my face with soft palps. I woke with a start, and with an odd fancy that some grayish animal had just rushed out of the chamber. I tried to get to sleep again, but I felt restless and uncomfortable. It was the day-gray hour when things were just creeping out of the darkness, when everything is colorless and clear-cut and yet unreal. I got up and went down into the great hall, and so out upon the flagstones of the front palace I thought I would make a virtue of necessity and see the sunrise. The moon was setting, and the dying moonlight and the first pallor of dawn were mingled in the half-ghostly half-light. The bushes were inky black with the ground of a somber gray, the sky colorless with cheerless, and up the hill I thought I could see ghosts. Several times I scanned the slope, I saw white figures. Twice I fancied I saw a solitary white ape-like creature running rather quickly up the hill. And once near the ruins, I saw a leash of them carrying some dark body. Then moved hastily. I did not see what became of them. It seemed they vanished among the bushes. The dawn was still indistinct, you must understand. I was feeling the chill, uncertain, early morning feeling you may have known. I doubted my eyes. As the eastern sky grew brighter, the night of the day came on, and its vivid coloring returned upon my world was once more. I scanned the view keenly, but I saw no vestige for my white figures. They were mere creatures of half-light. They must have been ghosts, I said. I wondered where they have dated, for a queer notion of great Athens came to my head and amused me. If each generation die and leave gross, he argued, the world will, at last will be overcrowded with them. On that theory, they would have grown innumerable number, some 800,000 hence, and it was no great wonder to see four at once. But the jest was unsatisfying, and I was thinking of these figures all morning, until Weena's rescue drove them out of my head. I associated them in some indefinite way with the white animals I started in the first passionate search for the time machine. But Weena was a pleasant substitute, yet all the same time they were soon designed to take far deadlier possessions in my mind. I think I have said how much hotter than our own was the weather of this golden age. I cannot account for it. It may have been that the sun was hotter, or that the earth was nearer the sun. It is usual to assume that the sun will go on cooling steadily in the future, but people unfamiliar with these such speculations as those of the young Darwin forget that the planets must ultimately fall back one by one into the parent body. As this catastrophe occur, the sun will blaze with renewed energy, and it may be some of the inner planets had suffered this fate. Whatever the reason, the fact remains that the sun was very much hotter than we knew it. Well, one very hot morning, my fourth, I think, as I was seeking shelter from the heat and glare in the colossal ruins near the great housing of which I slept and fed, there happened this strange thing. Clambering among these heaps of masonry, I found a narrow galley whose inside windows were blocked by fallen massive stones. By contrast to the brilliance outside, it seemed at first impenetrably dark to me. I entered it groping, for the chance from light to blackness made spots of color swim before me. Suddenly I halted, spellbound. A pair of eyes, luminous of reflection against the daylight without, was watching me out from the darkness. The old instinctive dread of the wild beast came upon me. I clenched my hands and steadfastly looking into the glaring eyeballs. I was afraid to turn. Then the thought of the absolute security in which humanity appeared to be in the living came to my mind. And then I remembered the strange terror of the dark. Overcoming my fear to some extent, I advanced a step and spoke. I admit that my voice was harsh and ill-controlled. I put my hand and touched something soft. At once the eyes darted sideways, and something white ran past me. I turned with my heart in my mouth, and saw a queer little ape-like figure. Its hands held down at a peculiar angle, running across the sunlit space before me. It blundered against the block of granite, staggering aside, and in a moment was hidden in the black shadow beneath another pile of ruined masonry. My impression of it is, of course, imperfect, but I know it was a little dull white and had strange large grayish red eyes. Also, that there was flaxen hair on its head and down its back. But as I say, it went too fast for me distinctly. I can even say whether it ran on all fours or with its forearms very low. Whether an instant's pause I followed into the second heap of ruins. I could not find it at first, but after a time, in the profound obscurity, I came upon one of those round, well-like openings of which I have told you, half closed by a fallen pillar. The sudden thought came to me, could this thing have vanished down the shaft? I lit a match looking for it down there. I saw a small white moving creature with large bright eyes, which regarded me steadfastly as I retreated. It made me shudder. It was so like a human spider. It was clambering down the wall, and now I saw for the first time the number of metal foot and hand rests forming a kind of ladder down the shaft. Then the light burned my finger, and fell out of my hand, going out as it dropped. When I had to light another, the monster had disappeared. I do not know whether or not I sat peering at the well, or it was not for some time that I could succeed to persuading myself that the thing I had seen was human, but gradually the truth dawned on me. That man had not remained one species, but had differentiated into two distinct animals. That my grateful children of the upper world were not the sole descendants of our generations, but this bleached, obscene, nocturnal thing, which had flashed upon me, was also the heir of all ages. I thought of flickering pillars, and of my theory of the underground ventilation. I began to suspect their true import, and what I wondered was this lemur doing in the scheme of the perfect balance organizations. How was it related to the indulgent serenity of the beautiful overworlders? And what was hidden down there at the foot of the shaft? I sat upon the edge of the well, telling myself that at any rate there was nothing to fear, and that I must descend for some solution to my difficulties. And withal, I was absolutely afraid to go. As I hesitated, two of the most beautiful underworld people came rushing into the amorous sport of across the daylight in the shadow. The male pursued the female, flinging flowers at her as he ran. They seemed distressed to find me, my arms against the overturned pillar, peering down the well. Apparently it was considered bad form to remark these apertures, for when I pointed this one and tried to frame a question about it in their tongue, they were still more visibly distressed and turned away. But they were interested by my matches, and I struck some to amuse them. I tried them again about the well, and again I failed. So presently I left them, meaning to go back to Weena and see what I could get from her. But my mind was already in revolution. My guesses and impressions were slippery and sliding to a new adjustment. I had no clue to the import of these wells, into the venting towers, and to my mystery of the ghosts, to say nothing of a hint at the meaning of the bronze gate and the fate of the time machine. And very vaguely there came a suggestion towards the solution of the economic problem that had puzzled me. Here was a new view. Plainly, the second species of man was subterranean. There were three kinds in particular, which made me think it's rare above ground. Was the outcome of the long-continued underground habitat. In the first place, there was the bleached look, common in most animals that live largely in the dark. The white fish of the Kentucky caves, for instance. Then, those with large eyes, with the capacity for reflecting light, are common features of nocturnal things. Witness the owl and the cat, And last of all, the evident confusion in the sunlight, that harshly yet fumbling awkwardness, flight towards darkness shadow, and the peculiar carriage of the head while in the light, all reinforced the theory of the extreme sensitiveness of the retina. Beneath my feet, then, the earth must have tunneled enormously, and there were tunnelings where the habitat of the new race, the presence of ventilating shafts and wells along the hill slopes. Wait, everywhere, in fact, except for the river valley, showed how universal were its ramifications. What so natural, then, as to assume that it was an artifact underworld, that such world was unnecessary to the comfort of the daylight race was done? The notion was so plausible that I, at once, accepted it, and went on to assume on how of this splitting the human species. I dare say you will anticipate the shape of my theory, though for myself, I soon felt that I fell far short of the truth. At first, perceiving the problems of my own age, it seemed clear as daylight to me that the gradual wildering of the present merely temporarily and socially difference between the capitalist and laborer was the key to the whole position. No doubt it will seem grotesque enough to you, and wildly incredible, and yet even now there were existing circumstances to point that way. There is a tendency to utilize the underground space for the less ornamental purposes of civilization. There is the Metropolitan Railway in London, for instance. There are new electric railways. There are subways. There are underground workrooms. And restaurants, and they increase and multiply. Eventually, I thought this tendency had increased till industry had gradually lost its bright light in the sky. I mean, that it had gone deeper and deeper and larger and even larger underground factories, sending in still increasing amounts on the time therein till, in the end, even now, does not an East End worker live in such artificial condition as practically to be cut from the natural surface of the earth? Again, an exclusive tendency of rich people due, no doubt, to the increasing refinement of education and the widening gulf between them, and the rude violence of the people is already leading to a closing. And this interests a considerable portion of the surface of the land. About London, for instance, perhaps half the prettier country is shut in intrusion, and this same widening gulf, which is due to the length of expense and the higher educational process, and the increased facilities for and temptations towards refined habitats on the part of the rich, will make that exchange between class and class, that promotion by intermarriage, which at present retards this splitting of our species along lines of social satisfaction, less and less frequent. So, in the end, above ground, you must have the haves, pursuing pleasure in the comfort and beauty, and below ground the have-nots, the workers getting continually adapted to the condition of their labor. Once they were there, they would no doubt have to pay rent, and not a little of it, for the ventilation of their caverns, and if they refused, they would starve or be suffocated for arrears. Such of them as were so constellated as to be miserable and rebellious would die, and in the end, the balance being permanent, the survivors would become as well adapted to the conditions of underground life and as happy as in their ways as the overworld people were to theirs. As it seemed to me, the refined beauty in the Etipolated pallor followed natural enough. The great triumph of humanity I had dreamed of took a different shape in my mind. I had been no such triumph of moral education and general cooperation as I had imagined. Instead, I saw real aristocracy, armed with a perfect science and working with a logical conclusion. The industrial system of today, its triumph had not been simply a triumph over nature, but a triumph over nature, and the explanation may have been absolutely wrong. I still think it is the most plausible one, even on this supposition of balanced civilization that was, at least, attained, must have thought since past its zenith, and was now far fallen into decay. The too perfect security of the overworlders had led them to a slow movement of degradation, and to start a general dwindling in size, strength, and intelligence. That I could see clearly enough already. What had happened to the undergrounders I did not yet suspect, but from what I had seen of the Murlocs, that, by the by, was the name of which these creatures were called, I can imagine these modifications of human types was even far more profound among the Eloi, the beautiful race that I already knew. Then came troublesome doubts. Why had the Murlocs taken my time machine? For I felt sure it was they who had taken it. Why, too, if the Eloi were masters, would they not restore the time machine to me? And why were they so terribly afraid of the dark? I proceeded to have said questions to question Weena about this underworld, but here to say was disappointed. At first she did not understand my questions, and presently she refused to answer them. She shivered as though the topic was unendurable, and when I pressed her, perhaps a little too harshly, she burst into tears. They were the only tears, except my own, I ever saw in the Golden Age. When I saw them, I ceased abruptly in trouble about the Murlocs, and I was concerned in banishing these signs of human inheritance from Weena's eyes. And soon she was smiling and clapping her hands as I slowly burnt a match. Chapter 9. The Morlocks. It may seem odd to you, but it was 2 days before I could follow up the newfound clue in what manifestly the proper way. I felt a particular shrinking from those pallid bodies. They were just a half-bleached color of the worms and the things one sees preserved in spirit in the Zoological Museum, and they were filthy cold to the touch. Probably my shivering was largely due to the sympathetic influence of the Eloi who discussed the Murlocs. I now began to appreciate. The new night fell. I did not sleep well. Perhaps my health was a little disordered. I was oppressed with perplexity and doubt. Once or twice I had the feeling of intense fear for which I could perceive no definite reason. I remember creeping noiselessly into the great hall where the little people were sleeping in the moonlight. That night, Weena was among them, and feeling reassured by the presence, it occurred to me that even then, that the course of the few days the moon must pass through its last quarter, and the nights grow dark. When the appearances of the unpleasant creatures from below, these whitened lemurs and their new vermin that had replaced the old, might be more abundant, and on both these days I had the restless feeling of one who shrinks in inevitable duty. I felt assured that the time machine was only to be recovered by boldly penetrating these mysteries of underground. Yet I could not face the mystery. If I did, I had a companion, it would have been different, but I was so horribly alone, and even to clamber down into the darkness of the well appalled me. I don't even know if you would understand my feelings, but I've never felt quite safe at my back. It was this restless and insecurity, perhaps, that drove me farther and farther afield in my exploring expeditions. Going to the southwest westward, towards the rising country that is now called Combwood, I observed far off in the direction of the 19th century Banstead a vast green structure, different in character from any I had hitherto seen. It was larger than the largest of the palaces or ruins. I certainly knew a type of Chinese porcelain. I knew, and the facade had a oriental look, the face of having luster, as well as a green pale tint, a kind of bluish green of a certain type of Chinese porcelain. This type in aspect suggested a difference in use, and I was minded to push on and explore. But the day was growing late, and I had to come up with the site of the place after a long, tiring circuit. So I resolved to hold over the adventure for the following day, and I returned to the welcoming of the caresses of little Weena. But next morning I perceived clearly enough that my curiosity regarding the palace of green porcelain was a piece of self-deception to enable me to shrink by another day, an experience I dreaded. I resolved I'd be making it decent without further wasting my time, and started out in the long morning towards the well, near the ruins of granite and aluminum. Little Weena ran to me. She danced beside me to the well, but when she saw me lean into the mouth and look downwards, she seemed strangely disconcerted. "Goodbye, little Weena," I said, kissing her, and then putting her down. I began to feel over the parchment of the climbing hooks. Rather hastily, I may as well confess, I forefeared my courage might leak away. At first, she watched me in amazement. She gave me the most piteous cries. Running to me, she began to pull at me with her little hands. I think her opposition nerved me rather to proceed. I shook her off, perhaps a little too rough, and in the moment I was in the throat of a well. I saw her anguish in the face of the parfait, and smiled to reassure her. Then I had to look down at the unstable hooks at which I clung. I had to clamber down a shaft of perhaps 200 yards. The descent was effected by means of metallic bars projecting from the sides of the wells, and these being adapted for the needs of a creature much smaller and lighter than myself. I was speedily cramped and fatigued by the descent, and not simply fatigued. One of the bars bent suddenly under my weight, and almost swung me off into the blackness beneath. For a moment I hung by one hand, and after the experience I did not dare to rest again. Though my arms and back were presently acutely painful, I went on clambering down the sheer descent with a quick motion as possible. Glancing upward, I saw the aperture, a small blue disc in which the star was visible, while little Weena's head showed as a small black projection. The thudding sound of the machine below grew louder and more oppressive. Everything save that the little disc was a profoundly dark, and when I looked up again, Weena had disappeared. I was in an agony of discomfort. I had some thought of trying to go up the shaft again and leave the underworld alone, but even while I turned this over in my mind, I continued to descend, at which, with intense relief, I saw dimly climbing up, a foot to the right of me, slender loophole in the wall. Swinging myself in, I found it to be an aperture of a narrow horizontal tunnel in which I could lie down and rest. It was not too soon. My arms ached and my back was cramped, and I was trembling from the prolonged terror of the fall. Besides this, the unbroken darkness had had my distressing effect on my eyes. The air was full of throb and hum and machinery pumping air down the shafts. I don't know how long I lay. I was aroused by the soft hand touching my face. Starting up in the darkness, I snatched up my matches and hastily striking one, saw 3 swooping creatures similar to one I'd seen above in the ground in the ruins. Hastily retreated before the light, living as they did, in what appeared to me as the impenetrable darkness. Their eyes were abnormally large and sensitive, just as are the pupils of an abnormal fish. And they reflected the light in the same way. I had no doubt they could see me in their rayless obscurity, and they did not have any fear of me apart from my light. But as soon as I struck a match in order to see them, they fled continually, vanishing into dark gutters and tunnels, from which their eyes glared at me in this strange fashion. I tried to call them, but the language they had was apparently different from that of the overworld people, so that I was needs left to my own unaided efforts and the thought of flight before exploring was even then in my mind. But I said to myself, "You are in for it now," and feeling my way along the tunnel, I found the noise machinery grow louder. Presently the walls fell around me, and I came to a large open space. Striking another match, and I saw I had entered a vast arched cavern, which stretched from the utter darkness beyond the range of light. I knew the view I had of it was as much as a good one I could see at the burning of the match. Necessarily, my memory is vague. Great shapes like big machines rose out of the dimness and cast grotesque black shadows in which dim spectral monarchs sheltered from the glare. The place, by the by, was very stuffy and oppressive, and the faint halidus of freshly shed blood was in the air. Some way down the central vista was a little table of white metal, laid with what seemed a meal. The Murlocs, at any rate, were carnivores. Even at the time, I remembered wondering what large animals could have survived to furnish the red joint I saw. It was very indistinct. A heavy smell. The big, unmeaning shapes. The obscene figures lurking in the shadows, and only waiting for the darkness to come at me again. Then the match burned down, and stung my finger, and fell, wrinkling red spots in the blackness. I had thought since how particularly ill-equipped I was for this experience. When I had started the time machine, I had started with an absurd assumption that the men of the future would certainly be infinitely ahead of ourselves in all of their appearances. I had come without arms, without medicine, without anything to smoke. At times, I missed tobacco frighteningly, even without matches. If I only had a Kodak, I could have flashed a glimpse at the underground in a second and examined its leisure. But as it was, I stood with only the weapon and powers that nature had bestowed me with: hands, feet, and teeth. These and 4 safety matches that still remained with me. I was afraid to push away and among all of the machinery in the dark, and I was the only one with the last glimpse of light. I discovered that my store of matches had run low. It had never occurred to me that the moment that there was any need to economize them, and I had wasted almost half a box in astonishing the overworlders, to whom fire was a novelty. Now, as I say, I had 4 left, and while I stood in the darkness, Hands torched mine. Like fingers came feeling over my face, and I was sensible of the peculiar, unpleasant odor. I fancied I heard the breathing of a crowd of those dreadful little beings around about me. I felt a box of matches in my hands being gently disengaged, and the other hand around me plucking at my clothing. The senses of the unseen creatures examining me was indescribably unpleasant. The sudden realization of my ignorance of their ways of thinking and doing came home to me very vividly in the darkness. I shouted at them loudly as I could. They stared away, and then I could feel them approaching me again. They clutched me more boldly, whispering odd sounds to each other. I shivered violently and shouted again, rather discouragedly. This time they were not so seriously alarmed, and they made a queer laughing noise as they came back to me. I will confess I was horribly frightened. I demanded to strike another match and escape the protection of its glare. I did so, the eking of the flicker of the scrap of paper from my pocket. I made good retreat to the narrow tunnel, but I had scarce tired this when my light was blown out, and in the blackness I could hear the murlocs rustling like wind leaves and pattering like the rain as they hurried after me. In a moment I was clutched by several hands, and there was no mistaking that they were trying to hold me back. I struck another light and waved it in their deviled faces. You can scarce imagine how nauseously inhuman they looked, those pale, chinless faces, and great lidless pinkish gray eyes. As they stared into the blindness of the bewilderment, I did not stay to look. I promise you, I retreated again, and when my second match had ended, I struck my third. It had almost burnt through when I reacted the opening into the shaft. I lay down on the edge for a throb of great pump below my goody. Then I felt aside for projecting hooks, and as I did so, the feet were grasping from behind me, and I was violently tugged downwards. I lit my last match and unconditionally went out. But I had my hand on the climbing bars now, and kicking violently, I disengaged myself from the clusters of the murlocs and was speedily clambering up the shaft, while they stayed peering and blinking at me. But one little wrench who followed me for some way, and now I secured my boots as a trophy. The climb seemed interminable to me. With the last 20 or 30 feet of the deadly nausea come across me, I had the greatest difficulty in keeping my bound. The last few yards was a frightful struggle against the faintness. Several times my head swam, and I felt all the sensations of falling. At last, however, I got the mouth somehow, and staggered out of the ruins into the blinding sunlight. I fell upon my face. Even the soil smelt sweet and cream. Then I remember Weena kissing my hands and ears, and the voice, among other Eloy. Then, for a time, I was insensible. Chapter 10. When night came. Now, indeed, I seemed in a worse case than before. Hitherto, except during the night anguish of the loss of the time machine, I had felt a sustaining hope of ultimate escape, but the hope was staggered by the new discoveries. Hitherto and I had merely thought myself impeded by the childish simplicity of these little people, and by some unknown forces which I had only to understand too instinctively. I loathed them, because I had felt as a man might feel who had fallen into a pit. My concern was with the pit and how it got out of it. Now I felt like a beast in a trap, whose enemies would come upon him soon. The enemy I dreaded may surprise you. It was the darkness of the new moon. Weena had put this into my head by some at first incomprehensible remarks about the dark night. It was not now such a very difficult problem to guess what the coming dark nights might mean. The moon was on the wane. Each night there would be a longer interval of darkness, and now I understood some slight degree of the reason of the fear of the little upworld people for the darkness. I wondered vaguely what full villainy it might be that the Murlocs did under the new moon. I felt pretty sure that my second hypothesis was all wrong. The upperworld people might once have been the favored aristocracy, but the Murlocs were mechanical servants. But that had long since passed away. The two species had resulted from the evolution of man and were sliding back down towards, or have already arrived at, an altogether new relationship. The Eltoi and the Cavolian kings had decayed to a mere beautiful fluidity. They still possessed the earth on surface, since the Murlocs, subterranean in their innumerable generations, had come at last to find the daylight surface intolerable, and the Murlocs, who made it as standing horse paws at the foot, or as the man enjoys killing animals in search for it, became ancient and desperate. Necessities had impressed in on the organism, but clearly the old order was already in the part reversed. The nemesis of this delicate one was creeping on apace. Ages ago, thousands of generations ago, man had thrust its brother man out to seas and the sunshine. Out to the ease and out to the sunshine. And now the brother was coming back, changed. Already the Eloi had begun to learn an old lesson anew. They were becoming reacquainted with fear, and suddenly they came into the head of the memory of the meat I had seen in the underworld. It seemed odd how it floated with my mind, not stirred up as it were by the current of my meditations, but coming in almost like a question from outside. I tried to crawl the form of it. I had a vague sense of something familiar, but I could not tell you what it was at the time. Still, however helpless the little people in the presence of the mysterious fear, I was different constituted. I came out of this age of ours, this ripe prime of human race, with a fear. When fear does not paralyze and mystery has lost its terrors, I, at least, would defend myself. Without further delay, I determined to make myself arms and a fastness where I might sleep. With that refuge at the base, I could face this strange world with some of that confidence I had lost in realizing that creatures night by night I lay exposed. I felt I could never sleep again until my bed was secure from them. I shuddered with the horror of what they might have already have examined me. I wandered during the afternoon along the valley of the Thames, but found nothing that commended itself to my mind as inaccessible. All the buildings and trees seemed easily practicable to such dexterous climbers of the Murlocs. To judge by their wells must be then the tall pinnacles of the palace of green porcelain, and the polished gleam of the walls came back to memory. And in the evening, taking Weena like a child upon my shoulders, I went up the hill towards the southwest. The distance I had reckoned was 7 or 8 miles, but it must have been near 18. I had first seen the palace on the moist afternoon, when distances were deceptively diminished. In addition, the heel of one toe of my shoe was loose, and the nail was working through its sole. They were comfortable old shoes I wore about indoors, so that I was lame. And it was already long past sunset when I came in sight of the first palace, silhouetted back against the pale yellow of the sky. Weena had been hugely delighted when I began to carry her, but after a while she desired me to let her down and ran along by the side of me, occasionally darting off to either hand to pick a flower to stick in my pockets. My pockets had always puzzled Weena, but at last I concluded that they were eccentric kind of vases for floral decoration. At least she utilized them for that purpose. And that reminds me, in changing my jacket, I found the time traveler paused, put his hand in his pocket, silently placed 2 withered flowers, not unlike very white mallows. Until he resumed his narrative. As the hush of the evening crept over the world, and we perceived over the hill of the crest towards Wimbledon, Weena grew tired and wanted to return home of the Greystone, but I pointed to different pinnacles of the Palace of Green Porcelain to her, and contrived to make her understand what we were seeking a refuge from her fear. You know the great pause that comes upon thinking things before the dusk? Even the breeze stops in the trees. To me, there's always an air of expectation about the evening stillness. The sky was clear, remote, and empty save a few thousand horizontal bars far down the sunset. Well, that night an expectation took a color out of my fears. In the dark calm, I seemingly preternaturally sharpened. I fancied I could not feel the hollowness of the ground beneath my feet. Could, indeed, almost see through it the Murlocs on their own ant-hill, going hither and thither, and waiting for the dark. In excitement, I fancied that they would receive my invasion of their burrows as a declaration of war. And why had they taken my time machine? So we went on quiet, and twilight deepened into night, and clear blue of the distance faded, and one star after another came out. The ground grew dim, and trees black. Weena's fears and her fatigue grew upon her. I took her into my arms, talked to her, and caressed her. Then, as darkness deeply grew, she put her arms around my neck, and closing her eyes, tightly pressed her face against my shoulder. So we went down the long slope into the valley. There in the dimness, I almost walked into a little river. I waited, and went up to the opposite side of the valley, past a number of sleeping houses by the statue, a faun, or some such figure, minus the head. Here, too, were acacias. So far I had seen nothing of the Murlocs, but it was yet early in the night, and the darker hours before the old moon rose were still to come. From the brow of the next hill I saw a thick wood spreading wide and black before me. I hesitated at this. I could see no end to it, either the right or the left, feeling tired. My feet in particular were very sore. I carefully lowered Weena from my shoulders as I halted and sat down upon the turf. I could no longer see the Palace of Green Porcelain, and I was in doubt of my direction. I looked into the thickness of the woods and thought of what it might hide. Under the dense tangle of the branches, one would be out of sight of the stars. The thickness of the woods, and thought of what might hide. Under the dense tangle of branches, one might be out of sight of the stars. Even where there's no longer lurking darkness, a danger I did not care to let my imagination loose upon, there would still be roots to stumble over and the tree boles to strike against. I was very tired too, in the excitements of the day. So I decided I would not face it, but I would pass the night upon the open hill. Weena, I was glad to find, was fast asleep. I carefully wrapped her in my jacket, sat down beside her to wait for the moonrise. The hillside was quiet, deserted, but from the back of the wood there came now and there, then a stir of living things. Above me shone the stars. Then it was very clear. I felt a certain sense of friendly comfort in their twinkling. All the old constellations had gone from the sky. However, the slow movement from which is impenetrable in the 100 human cycles had long since rearranged them in the sky in unfamiliar groupings, but the Milky Way, it seemed to me, was still in the same tattered streamer of the stardust as of yore. Southland, as I judged it, was a very bright star that was new to me. It was very more splendid than our own green Sirius, and amid all these scintillating points, the lights of one bright star shone kindly and steadily, like the faces of an old friend. Looking at these stars suddenly dwarfed my own troubles and gravities of terrestrial life. I thought of their fathomable distance and the slow, inevitable drift of their movements out of the unknown past into the unknown future. I thought of a great distance and the slow, inevitable drift from their movements out of the unknown past into the unknown future. I thought of the great processional cycle that the pull of the earth described. Only 4 times had that silent revolution occurred during all the years that I had traversed. And during those few revolutions, all the activity, all the traditions, all the complex organizations, the narrations, the languages, literatures, aspirations, and even the mere memory of man as I knew it had been swept out of existence. Instead were these frail creatures who had forgotten their high ancestry and the white things which I went in terror. Then I thought of the great fear that was between these two species. For the first time, with a sudden shudder, came to the knowledge of what I meant, of what the meat I had seen might be. Yet, it was too horrible. I looked at little Lena sleeping beside me, her face white, star-like, and dismissed the thought. Through the long night, I held my mind off the Morlocks as long as I could. I willed, and I willed away the time by trying to fancy I could find signs of old constellations in the new confusion. The sky kept very clear, except for a hazed cloud or so. No doubt I dozed a few at times. Then, as the vigil wore off, came a faintness in the eastward sky, like the reflection of some colorless fire, and the old moon rose, thin and peaked white. And close behind, and overtaking it, and overflowing it, the dawn came, pale at first, and then a growing pink and warm. No Morlocks had approached us. Indeed, I had seen none upon the hill last night, and in confidence of renewed day, it almost seemed to me my fear had been unreasonable. I stood up, found my foot with the loose heel swollen, the ankle painfully under my heel, so I sat down, took off my shoes, and flung away. I awakened Weena, and we went into the woods, now green and pleasant instead of black and forbidding. We found some fruit, wherewith to break our fast. We soon met others of the Deatney, laughing and dancing in the sunlight, as though there was no such thing in the nature as the night. And then I thought once more of the meat I had seen. I felt assured of what it was, and from the bottom of my heart I pitied the last feeble reel from my great flood of humanity. Clearly, at some time, long ago of human decay, the Morlocks' food had run short. Possibly they had lived on rats and such like vermins. Every now man is far less discriminating and exclusive in his food, and he was far less lucky than monkeys. His prejudice against human flesh is no deep-seated instinct. And so these inhuman sons of men, I tried to look at the thing in a scientific spirit. After all, they were less human and more remote than our cannibal ancestors of 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, and the intelligence that would have made this state of things a torment had gone. Why should I trouble myself? These Eloi are mere fatted cattle, which the ant-like Morlocks preserved and preyed upon, probably saw the breeding of, and there was Weena dancing at my side. When I tried to preserve myself from the horror that came upon me by regarding it as a rigorous punishment of human selfishness, man had been content to live in ease and delight upon these labors of the fellow man, had taken necessity as his watchlord and excuse, and in fullness of time necessity had come home with him. I even cried a carol-like scorn of this wretched aristocracy in decay, but this attitude of mind was impossible. However great their intelligence, degradation, like Eloi had kept too much from the human form not to claim my sympathy, and to make me perforce a shatter in the digression of their fear. I had at the time very vague ideas as to the course I would pursue. My first was to secure some safe place to refuge, and to make myself such arms of metal or stone as I could contrive. Then that necessity was immediate. In the next place, I hoped to produce some means of fire so that I could have a weapon of a torch at hand for nothing. I knew it would be more effective against the Morlocks. Then I wanted to arrange some way to break open the doors of the bronze under the White Sphinx. I had in mind a battering ram. I had a persuasion that if I could enter those doors to carry a late blaze rod before me, I should discover the time machine and its escape. I could not imagine the Morlocks were strong enough to move it that far anyway. Weena had discovered to bring me over time, and turning such schemes over in my mind, I pursued our way through the building in which my fancy had been chosen in the dwelling. Chapter 11. The Palace of Green Porcelain. I found the Palace of Green Porcelain where we approached it about noon, deserted and fallen into ruin. Only a red vase of glass remained in its windows, and the great sheets of the great facing had fallen away from the corroded metallic framework. It lay very high upon a turfy down, and looking northeastward before I entered it. I was surprised to see a large estuary or even creek, where I judged Wandsworth and the Battersea must once have been, though I thought then, though I never followed up on the thought, of what might have happened or might have been happening to the seeing things in the sea. The material of the palace provided an examination to be indeed porcelain, and on the face of it I saw an inscription in some of unknown characters. I thought, rather foolishly, that Weena might help me interpret this, but I only learned that the bare idea of writing had never been entered her head. She seemed to me, I fancy, more human than she was, perhaps because her affection was so human. Within the big valves of the door, which were open and broken, we found set a customary hall, a long gallery lit by many side windows. First glance, I was reminded of a museum. The tiled floor was thick with dust. Remarkable array of miscellaneous objects was shrouded in the same grey covering. Then I perceived standing strange and gaunt in the center of the hall. A Migrathium. The skull and upper bones lay beside it in thick dust. In one place where rainwater had dropped through, a leak in the roof, the thing itself had been worn away. Further, in the galaxy of the huge skeleton barrel of Bronchiosaurus, my museum hypothesis was correct. Going towards the side, I found what appeared to be sloppy shells, and cleaning away my thick dust, I found the old, familiar glass cases of our own time, but they must have been airtight, to judge from the fair preservation of some of the contents. Clearly, we stood among the ruins of some later-day South Kensington. Here, apparently, the paleontology section had a splendid array of fossils. It must have been through the inevitable process of decay that had been staved off over a time, and had, through an extinction of bacteria and fungi, lost 99 hundredths of its force. And nevertheless, with extreme sureness of its extreme slowness, at work again upon its treasures, here and there I found traces of little people in the shapes of rare fossils, broken to pieces or threaded in strings upon reeds. There are cases, and some instances of bodily removed by the Murdochs, as I judged. The palace was very silent. Thick dust minced our footsteps. Weena, who had been rolling a sea urchin down the slopping grass of the case, presently came as I stared about me, very quietly took my hand and stood beside me. And at first I was so much surprised by this ancient monument of an intelligent age that I had no thought to the possibility it was presented. Even my preoccupation about the time machine receded a little from my mind. To judge the size of this place, the Palace of Green Porcelain had a great deal for it. More in the galaxy of paleontology, possibly historical galleries, and it might be even a library. To me, at least in my present circumstances, these would be vastly more interesting than the spectacle of old-time geology in decay. Exploring, I found another short gallery running transversely to the first. This appeared to be devoted to minerals, and the sight of a block of sulfur set my mind running on gunpowder, but I could find no saltpetre. Indeed, no nitrates of any kind. Doubtless they had deceased ages ago, yet the sulfur hung on my mind and set a train of thinking. As for the rest of the contents of the galaxy, through on the whole, there are the best fermented of all I've seen. I had little interest. I'm no specialist in mineralogy, and I went down a very ruinous aisle running parallel to the first hall I had entered. Apparently this section had been devoted to natural history, but everything had long passed its out of recognition. Few shriveled up, departed plants, that was all. I was sorry for that, because I should have been glad a trace of patient readjustments by which the conquest of animated nature had been attained. Then we came to a galaxy of simply colossal proportions, but singularly ill-lit. The floor of its running downwards at a slight angle from the end at which I entered. At intervals, white globes hung from the ceiling, many of them cracked and smashed, which suggested originally the place had been artificially lit. Here I was more in the element, for rising on either side of me were huge bulks of big machines, all greatly corroded to many broken down, but still some fairly complete. I have a certain weakness for mechanism, and I incline to linger among them. These, the more so as for the most complete. I have a certain weakness. Oh, what? Parts. They had the interest of puzzles. I can make only the vaguest guesses as to what they were for. I fancied that I could solve their puzzles. I could find myself in possession of powers that might be of use against the Morlocks. Suddenly, Wendy came very close to my side, so suddenly that she startled me. Had it not been for her, I don't think I could have noticed the floor of the gallery sloped at all. Footnote: it may be, of course, that the galaxy did not slope, but the museum was built on the side of a hill. At the end I had come, and that was quite above ground, and lit by a rare slit, and like windows. As you went down the length, the ground came up against these windows, until at last there was a pit like the arena of a London house before, each and only one narrow light of the daylight at the top. I slowly went along, puzzling about the machines, and had been too intent upon looking to notice the gradual dimensions of light, until Weena's increasing apprehensions drew my attention. Then I saw in the gallery ran notice down, at last into thick darkness. I hesitated, and then I looked around me. I saw that the dust was less abundant, and the surface less even. Further away, towards the dimness, it appeared to be broken by a number of small, narrow footprints. My sense of immediate presence of Alex revived me. At that, I felt that I was wasting my time in the academic examination of machinery. I called to mind that it was far advanced in the afternoon, and I still had no weapon, no refuge, and no means of making a fire. And then, down in the remote blackness of the galaxy, I heard a peculiar pounding, the same odd noise I had heard down the well. I took Weena's hand and struck the sudden idea. I left her, turned to a machine from which the project a lever, not like those of Cinnabon, clambering down in the stand, and grasping her lever in my hands, I pulled a weight upon it sideways. Suddenly, Weena, deserted in the central aisle, began to whimper. I had judged the strength of the lever pretty correctly, for it snapped after a minute's strain, and I rejoined her with the mace in my hand. Then, more than efficient, I judged, for any Morlock skull that might counter, and I longed for very much to kill a Morlock or so. Very unhuman, you may think, to want to go killing one of your own descendants, but it was impossible, somehow, to feel any humanity in these things. Only my disinclination to leave Weena, and of persuasion that if I began to slake my thirst for murder, my time machine might suffer, restraining me from going straight down the gallery and killing those brutes I heard. Well, mace in one hand and Weena in the other, and went out the galaxy and into another, still larger one, which, at first glance, reminded me of the military chapel hung tattered flags. The brown and charred rags that hung down from the sides of it I presently recognized that as the decayed beasts of books. They had long since dropped to pieces, and every semblance of print had left them. But here and there were warped boards and cracked metallic clamps that told the tale well enough. I had been a literacy man, I thought. I might perhaps have moralized the futility of all ambitions. But, as it was, the thing that struck me with the keenest force was enormous waste of labor, to which the somber wilderness of rotten paper testified. At the time, I will confess that I thought chiefly of the philosophical transactions in my own 17th paper upon physical optics. Then, going up a broad staircase, we came to what may once have been a gallery of technical chemistry, and here I had not a little hope of useful discoveries, except at one end there was a roof that had collapsed this galaxy, gallery was well preserved. I went eagerly in every unbroken case. And at last, in one of the airtight cases, I found a box of matches. Very eagerly I tried them. It was indeed perfect. Good. They were not even damp. I turned to Weena. Dance, I cried in her tongue, for now I had a weapon indeed against these horrible creatures we've feared. And so, in the derelict museum, upon this soft carpeting of the dust, to Weena's huge delight, I solemnly performed a kind of composite dance, whistling The Land of the Leal cheerfully as I could. In part it was a modern can-can, in part a step dance, in part a skirt dance, so far as my tale could permit it, and in part original. For I am naturally inventive, as you can know. Now, I still think that the box of matches to have escaped the wear of time for immemorial years was a most strange, as for me, it was a most fortunate thing. Yet, oddly enough, I had a far unliker substance that was camphor. I found it in a sealed jar that, by chance, I suppose, had been really hermetically sealed. I fancied at first that it was Parfolian wax, and smashed the glass accordingly, but the odor of the camphor was unmistakable. In the universal decay, the volatile substance had chanced to survive. Perhaps through many thousands of centuries, it reminded me of a Safiyyat painting I had once done with the lake of fossil benemite that must have perished and become fossilized millions of years ago. I was about to throw it away, but I remembered that it was inflammable and burnt with a bright flame. Was, in fact, an excellent candle, and I put it in my pocket. I found no explosives, however, nor any means of breaking down bronze doors. Yet my iron crowbar was the most hopeful thing I chanced upon. Nevertheless, I returned to the galaxy, greatly elated. I can't tell you the story of the long afternoon. It required a great amount of detail to recall explorations, and in all the proper order. I remember the long galaxies of resting stands and arms, how I hesitated between the crowbar and a hatchet or the sword. I could not carry both, however. My bar of iron promised best against the bronze gates. There were a number of guns, pistols, and rifles, the most of them masses of rust, but many were some new metal, still fairly sound. But with any cartridges or powder they may once have been rotted into dust. One corner I saw a charred and shattered, perhaps, I thought, by an explosion above the specimens. Another was an array of idols, Colosseum, Mexican, Grecian, Phoenician, every country on earth, I should think. And here yields an irresistible impulse. I wrote my name upon the nose of a specific stalagmite monster from South America that particularly took me fancy. As the evening drew on, my interests warmed, and I went through the galaxy, the gallery after gallery, dusty, silent, often ruinous. The exhibits sometimes mere heaps of rust and lignite, sometimes fresher. In one place, I suddenly found myself near a model of a tin mine, and then, by the mere accident, I discovered in an airtight case 2 dynamite cartridges. I shouted, "Eureka!" and smashed the cases open with joy. Then came a doubt. I hesitated. Then, selecting a little side gallery, I made my essay. I never felt such a disappointment as I did in waiting 5, 10, 15 minutes for an explosion. That never came. Of course, the things were dummies, and I thought I might have guessed from their presence. I really believe that they might not be so. I should have rushed off Inkshuni and blown Sphinx, bronze doors, and, as if provided, my chance of finding the time machine altogether into non-existence. It was, after all, I think. It was after that, I think, that we came into a little open court within the palace. It was turfed, had 3 fruit trees, so we rested and refreshed ourselves. Towards sunset, I began to consider our position. Night was creeping upon us, and my inaccessibility hiding palace was still to be found. But it troubled me very little now. I had in my possession a little thing that was, perhaps, the best of all defenses against the Murlocs. I had matches. I had the camphor in my pocket, too, if a blaze was needed. It seemed to me that the best thing we could do would be to pass the night in the open, protected by a fire. In the morning, there was the getting of the time machine. Toward that, as yet, I had my own iron mace. But now, with my growing knowledge, I felt very differently towards those bronze doors. Up to this, I had refrained from forcing them, largely because the mystery of the other side had never impressed me for being very strong. And I hoped the find of iron bars, not although inadequate for the work. Chapter 12. In the darkness. We emerged from the palace within the sun. It was still part of the horizon. I was determined to reach the White Sphinx early the next morning, and eerie the dusk, purpose pushing through the woods that had stopped me on the previous journey. My plan was to go as far as possible that night, then building a fire to sleep, protection from the gaze, from its glare. Accordingly, as we went along, I gathered any sticks and dried grass I saw, and presently had my arms full of such litter. Thus loaded, our progress was slower than I had anticipated. Besides, Lena was tired, and I also began to suffer from sleepiness too. So that it was a falling night, we reached the woods. Upon the strawberry hill of the edge, Lena would have stopped, fearing the darkness before us, but in a single sense, impending calamity. That should indeed have served me as a warning, drove me onward. I had been without sleep for nights, 2 days, and I was feverish, irritable. I felt sleep coming upon me, and the Murlocs with it. While we hesitated among the black bushes behind us, the dim against their blackness, I saw 3 crouching figures. There was scrub and long grass about us, and I don't feel safe in their imperious approach. The forest, I calculated, was rather less than a mile across. If we could get through it to the bare hillside, there, as it might seem, was altogether safe for a resting place. I thought that, with my matches and camphor, I could contrive to keep path illuminated through the woods. Yet it was evident that if I was to flourish matches with my hands, I should have to abandon my firewood. So I rather reluctantly put it down, and then it came to my head that I would amaze our friend behind by lighting it. I was to discover an atrocious folly in the proceeding, but it came to my mind as an ingenious move for covering our retreat. I don't know if you have ever thought what a rare thing flame must be in absence of man in temperature climate. The sun's heat is rarely strong enough to burn, even when it's forced a few dewdrops. As is sometimes the case in most tropical districts, lightning may blast and blacken, but it really gives off a rise of widespread fire. Decaying vegetation may occasionally smolder the head of its fermentation, but this rarely results in flame. In the decadence, too, the art of fire making had been forgotten on the earth. The red tongues that were licking my heap of wood were altogether new and strange things to Lena. She wanted to run with it, play with it, and she would cast herself into it if I had not restrained her. But I caught her up, and in spite of her struggle, plunged boldly before me into the woods. For a little while, the glare of the fire lit the path. Looking back previously, I could see, through the crowded stems, that from the heap of sticks and blaze had spread to some bushes adjacent, and a curved line of fire was creeping up the grass hill. I laughed at that and turned towards the darkness trees again. It was very black, and wind clung to me convulsively. But there was still, as my eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, sufficient light for me to avoid the stems. Overhead, it was simply black, except for a gap of remote blue sky shone down upon up there. I lit none of my matches because I had no hand free. Upon my left arm I carried a little one, and right arm I had my iron bar. For some way I heard nothing but the crackling twigs under my feet, the faint rustle of the breeze above. From my own breathing and the throb of the blood vessels in my ears, then I seemed to know of a pattering behind me. I pushed on grimly, and pattering grew more distinct, and I caught the same queer sound and voices I heard in the underworld. There were evidently several of the Morlocks, and they were closing upon me. Indeed, in another minute, I felt a tug at my coat. There was something at my arm, and Weena shivered violently, and became quite still. It was time for a match, but to get one I must put her down. I did so, and I fumbled it with my pocket, struggling to begin in the darkness on my knees. Perfectly silent on her, and with the same peculiar cooling sound from the Morlocks. Soft little hands, too, were creeping upon my coat and back, touching even my neck. Then the match scratched and fizzed. I held it flaring, and saw the white back of the Morlocks in flight of them into the trees. I hastily took the lump of camphor from my pocket and prepared to light it as soon as the match should wane. Then I looked at Lena. She was lying clutching my feet and quite motionless, with her face to the ground. With a sudden fright, I stood up to her. She seemed scarcely to breathe. I lit the block of camphor and flung it into the ground, and as it split and flared up, it drove back the Morlocks in the shadows. I knelt down and lifted her. The wood behind seemed full of stir and murmur of a great company. She seemed to have fainted. I put her carefully on my shoulder and rose to push on. And then came a horrible realization. In maneuvering with the matches and Weena, I turned myself about several times, and now I had no faintest idea in which direction lay my path. For all I knew, I might be facing back towards the Palace of Green Porcelain. I found myself in a cold sweat. I had to think rapidly about what to do. I determined to build a fire and encamp where we were. I put Weena, still motionless, down upon the turfy bowl, and very hastily, my first lump of camphor lighted, I began collecting sticks and leaves. Here and there, out of the darkness around me, Morlock's eyes shone like carbuncles.